Welcome to one of the most iconic regions in the United States. The area we'll talk about stretches from Monterey in the south through the San Francisco Bay and up into the redwoods of Marin County. Most striking, perhaps, is the Golden Gate Bridge crossing the strait that so many explorers would miss throughout the years. HearHere does many things, but our goal remains simple: to draw you in and offer up the history of a region unknown or forgotten. Our commitment to that idea, and specifically to the first people to inhabit the land, is a responsibility we not only feel but pledge to always start with. This is a region overflowing with resources, but despite that, or maybe even because of it, the history here is defined by adversity and survival. And there is no more heartbreaking example of this than the first people to call the Bay Area home. Little is known of the first people to live here, but the shell mounds dating back as far as 12,000 years indicate they most likely migrated across the Bering Strait and down the coast. Their descendants would be called the Miwok and Marin and the Ohlone throughout the bay. Miwok simply means people, and Ohlone is coast dweller. It's estimated that at its highest point, some 10,000 Ohlone and Miwok would coexist in an area which now holds more than 8 million. They would form as many as 40 smaller tribes scattered throughout the region. Elk, grizzly, deer, and mountain lion were known to roam the region in numbers impossible to imagine. In the bay and along the coastline, seals and otters were said to be so numerous that they painted the beaches black. In later years, they would be just one more resource coveted by outsiders and exploited to the edge of extinction. It was a land that had faithfully provided for thousands of years. And while life couldn't be painted as perfect, the sheer abundance created a balance that limited competition and no doubt helped to avoid disputes. Because they lived on the water, the impression might be that they were able sailors, and to a degree they were, moving easily through the bay in the calm waters and out to two small islands in the bay that would later have their own stories. But because they built their canoes from tule rushes instead of redwood, the Miwok and Ohlone would not push quite as far into the open ocean as their Chumash neighbors to the south. Those same rushes pulled from freshwater marshes would also be used to build the Ohlone dome-shaped homes. Most of those marshes are gone now, but just off Highway 880 in the Coyote Hills Regional Park, some still remain, alongside a recreation of an Ohlone canoe village. It's just the smallest taste of a culture that would outlast Greece and Rome combined and serve as a sad reminder of a way of life that would soon be swept away. These people who had prospered for thousands of years would have no way of knowing that the land they had known all their lives was being divided even now by European powers. 2 years after Columbus would land in the New World, a treaty would be made giving the dominant power in the world at the time, Spain, all of North and South America. It would take 60 years for Spanish explorers to make their way into what would be called California. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo's expedition would be the first. His orders were to uncover any riches to be plundered and to measure any military opposition to that end. But Cabrillo would find little of either as he moved up the coast. Evidence of gold and silver was nowhere to be found, and the people he would encounter by any measure were no threat to the Empire of Spain. He did, however, in a journal note the distinct smell of oil. Cabrillo's whole expedition could easily be defined by what he missed, and that would include sailing right past the largest bay in all of California. He wouldn't be the only one, however. The next 200 years could only be described as divine intervention for the Miwok and Ohlone, with the greatest navigators of their time continuing to miss the small channel that would someday be called Golden Gate. Even the notorious English privateer, Sir Francis Drake, with all of his audacity weaving his way through Spanish galleons, would go right past, landing just 50 miles north and staying for months without a clue of the treasure sitting so close below. But luck could only carry the first people so long, and first contact would finally come with Sebastian Vizcaino's expedition in 1602. When he entered Monterey Bay and met the Ohlone, history would note that there was not much to the encounter, and with nothing to hold him, Vizcaino would continue his exploration north, reporting on his return nothing of significance, having no more luck than the rest. The man who would have the acclaim of naming the famous bays of San Diego, San Pedro, and Santa Barbara would also join the ranks of those who completely missed San Francisco. With so little to lure the Spanish back, it would be another 162 years before they'd be seen again. The historical argument of how such a massive body of water could be hidden for so long follows two lines. Some say it's the narrow strait and those two small islands in the bay that created the illusion of an uninterrupted coastline from the open ocean. Others have argued that it was San Francisco's famous fog that made for the perfect cover. But whatever the cover, it couldn't last forever. It would only be news of Russian fur traders pushing down the coast that would cause the vacant landlords to come rushing back to solidify their hold on the territory. The Spanish response would be to build a series of missions throughout California, doubling as forts. Gaspar de Portola would lead the charge with a land-based expedition up the coast to start a settlement in Monterey. But on arrival, Portola would fail to recognize the bay from the description written so long ago. Sick, weary, and ragged after so many months of travel, the expedition would push north, taking them to the crest of what is now Sweeney Ridge. We can only imagine their shock as the first Europeans would look down on a bay that would become known as San Francisco. A body of water so big that, as one expedition member remarked, it could hold every ship from every navy in all of Europe and still have room to spare. For the Miwok and Ohlone, the full weight of that day wouldn't be felt until 6 years later, when the first Europeans sailed into the bay and made contact. When the two-masted San Carlos cleared the strait, its captain Juan Manuel de Ayala immediately understood the treasure before him and realized just what it would mean for Spain as the Ohlone rode out in friendship greeting him as an honored guest. The expedition would stay for 48 days to fully explore the bay. It would be Ayala who would come up with the names for the two small islands that not only served to hide the channel for so long, but were also favorites for the first people to come out in their canoes and harvest oysters. He would call them Alcatraz and Angel Islands. But in another twist of fate, a cartographer in 1826 would accidentally switch the names, a mistake that lives to this day. Ayala would relate the stories of his men singing with the Ohlone on Angel Island. But what would pass for camaraderie would be nothing more than the Spanish taking a measure of their new enemy, and it would only be a matter of time until they made their first move. The events that follow would go down in a sadly familiar path, and it would be cataclysmic for the Ohlone and Miwok. The year was 1776, and it's ironic to think that while Spain was laying the groundwork to take over one side of the continent, a young America was declaring its independence on the other. The strategy of the Spanish was simple: to take advantage of the Ohlone and Miwok's curiosity, drawing them in with promises of eternal salvation and the advantages of modern technology. But over time, the first people's realization that baptism led to a life of servitude would take them from anger into a despair that's impossible to imagine. Those who escaped were hunted down. Those who stayed endured horrible living conditions and rampant disease. The result was devastation. In the space of 70 years, the native population fell by 90%. A German botanist and poet who visited in 1816 wrote simply, "The Indians are dying out in the missions at a rate that is increasing terribly. Their tribe is vanishing." And in 1820, a British officer described the people in the missions as inmates, as in miserable a condition as it was possible to conceive. But as the subjugation of the native populations continued unchecked, the Spanish themselves would be driven from North America when Mexico rose up to win their independence. It's hard to have sympathy for the Spanish being denied the massive gold deposits that they had hoped for all along. But the cycle would continue, and it wouldn't be long before Mexico was also forced from the region by an expanding United States and the creation of a new border. The first people again would have no voice in the exchange of their lands, and a population that was once as many as 10,000 in 1847 would be down to only 34 souls. Pedro Alcantara, one of those very few, described his fate and that of his people. "I am very old," he said. "My people were once around me like the sands of the shore, many, many. They have all passed away. They have died like the grass. They have gone to the mountains. I do not complain. The antelope falls with the arrow. I had a son, I loved him. When the palefaces came, he went away. I do not know where he is. I am a Christian Indian. I am all that is left of my people. I am alone. The Ohlone and Miwok, cultures that had flourished since the first stone was placed in the Great Wall of China, were all now but wiped out. San Francisco was about to begin a meteoric rise, with the Miwok and Ohlone largely made inconsequential in their own land. The California gold rush of 1848 would reshape San Francisco forever. When news of those first strikes hit, immigrants poured in, and San Francisco went from a population of 600 to more than 25,000 in a space of a single year. The stampede was so great that many coming by sea would simply abandon their crafts in the bay, some going as far to run them aground to claim the land beneath. San Francisco became a boomtown in every sense, home to all manner of vice, graft, and treachery. And gold was the coin of the realm. Gold dust, actually. A pinch would get a miner his first drink, and bartenders would be valued for the sheer size of their hands, guaranteeing a bigger pinch for the owners. Of all the immigrants coming into San Francisco, the Chinese would make the biggest impact. They were relentless workers, able to pull gold from claims thought long dead, and even going as far to dig under the saloon floors to collect any gold dust that fell through the cracks. The reward for their ingenuity and success would be a series of taxes specifically aimed at them with the intent of forcing them out of business as well as the area. It was a selfish and predictable response that must have added to the weight of being in a foreign country surrounded by hatred and intolerance. Though it only lasted a few years, the gold rush would generate enough wealth to change the nation, and in one instance would even drag the entire banking system to its knees when a single ship carrying gold from San Francisco sank off the coast of Carolina. The SS Central America, referred to in history as the Ship of Gold, went down with what today would be over $500 million in gold. So much wealth that the already shaky banks would falter. News of the loss and impending financial crisis ripped across the country. With all of its wealth, San Francisco still hungered for a greater connection to the rest of the country. One attempt would be a network of riders on horseback that could get a letter from Missouri to California in just 10 days. It would be called the Pony Express, and though the experiment lasted for only a year, it would leave an indelible print on the mythology of the American West. The next jump would be to connect the coast by rail, and once again Chinese labor would be called upon, making up almost 80% of the workforce on the Central Pacific Line. In 1869, the last golden spike would be driven home in Promontory, Utah, making the dream of transcontinental travel a reality. San Francisco's rise would not be without setbacks. The Great Quake of 1906 lasted only for a minute, but the resulting fires would leave a city forever scarred with 3,000 dead and almost 30,000 buildings destroyed. With all the devastation, the city would again rebuild to even greater heights, thanks in part to a banker who pulled his assets out in a garbage wagon just moments before fire hit his vaults. His was the Bank of Italy, and it would later become the Bank of America. But the great earthquake and fire would also provide cover for one of the greatest land grabs in history. A long-coveted resource in the High Sierras would again be targeted, and Congress asked to approve the damming of one of the great valleys in Yosemite, all to supply the Bay Area with much-needed water. John Muir, so instrumental in bringing attention to Yosemite, would block the dam for years. But the needs of a growing San Francisco and political cronyism would end his fight. The battle over Hetch Hetchy would be Muir's last, as he died a year later, some say of a broken heart. But his fight would force the eyes of the nation onto the environment he held so dear, and the fight for Hetch Hetchy, still under 300 feet of water, continues to this day. With bad luck comes good, and the crash of 1929, so devastating to other parts of the country, somehow spared the banks of San Francisco and spurred massive infrastructure projects, including the Golden Gate Bridge, which stands today as one of the wonders of the modern world. Joseph Strauss would be the driving force behind the bridge, but it would be Leon Masseff, a Latvian immigrant who designed its iconic form along with engineer Charles Ellis. But Strauss was not one to be overshadowed, and he fired Ellis while the bridge was still being built. Even though he must have been devastated, Ellis showed unusual character, refusing to leave, and instead staying on to the inn, unpaid, but unable to walk away. John C. Fremont, a major who took control of California during the United States war with Mexico, would be the one to coin the name Golden Gate, speaking directly to the incredible wealth that would flow out of the narrow channel. But one of the great curiosities when looking at the bridge is that the color doesn't match the name. Instead, the bridge's unique color would be chosen by the architect Irving Morrow to complement the landscape and make it stand out in San Francisco's thick fog. World War II would once again highlight both San Francisco's importance and its darker realities. Fort Mason became a major hub for the Pacific Theater, but in war, old prejudice found new ground with the internment of Japanese Americans, a dark chapter that America is still trying to reconcile. After the war, the push for progress and innovation would continue to be central to the region. It would also bring into question what it meant to be an American at all. A post-war San Francisco Renaissance would transform the region into a hub for writers, poets, and philosophers. Ginsberg and Kerouac would define the Beat generation here, and that movement would break ground for those to come, including the 1967 Summer of Love, which was played out in the streets of Haight-Ashbury. Across the bay in Berkeley, another movement would challenge the foundations of government and an unpopular war in Vietnam. It was that sense of urgency that created a space for the LGBT movement to grow and evolve. San Francisco would welcome the first gay elected official, the first gay marriage, and so many more milestones. And even Alcatraz, which once held America's most dangerous, would become the site of rebellion, taken over in 1969 by Native American activists who stubbornly held out for 2 years, calling for greater rights. The sad irony lost on most would be that the Ohlone and Miwok played no part in the protest, with so few remaining. Today, San Francisco continues to be a focal point for both resistance and innovation. The region and its many people have cycled through boom and bust, rise and fall, death and rebirth. This is the area you're driving through. Welcome to San Francisco.